Have you ever encountered a work of art that, rather than simply reflecting its time, seemed to tear through the veil of reality and show you a terrible and undeniable prophecy about the future? Imagine yourself in 1969, while the world celebrated humanity's arrival on the moon as the apex of human ingenuity. A colossal and frightening sound was emerging from the bowels of London, a sound that spoke not of triumph, but of imminent collapse. It was a sonic monolith, a cathedral of despair built upon the anxieties of an era, living under the constant and omnipresent shadow of the atomic mushroom cloud. In that year, a group of visionary musicians calling themselves King Crimson released their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, and on it, a track of nearly 9 minutes in length, so profound in its melancholy and so assertive in its desolation, that it has echoed through the decades not as a song, but as an epitaph for a world on the brink of suicide. That composition is Epitaph, and its transcendent power as one of the most potent anti-war anthems ever conceived lies not in protest slogans or pamphleteering anger, but in its solemn symphonic resignation to a humanity seemingly determined to annihilate itself. To unravel the visceral power of this work, we must dissect it not just as music, but as a cultural artifact, a treatise on the anatomy of fear, and a lyrical monument to human folly. To absorb the magnitude of Epitaph, a deep immersion into the zeitgeist of 1969 is imperative. This was not the cartoonish peace and love pastiche that simplistic historical retrospectives often present. That was a world that had lost its innocence in a brutal and definitive way. The counterculture dream, which had reached its utopian peak in the summer of love of 1967, was beginning to curdle into a nightmare. The Altamont Festival, with its violence and death, would soon happen, exposing the darkness hiding beneath the facade of idealism. The murders committed by Charles Manson's family, a twisted cult born from the fringes of that same counterculture, were terrorizing California. Optimism was in sharp decline, replaced by a palpable cynicism and paranoia. The Cold War was not an abstract concept of geopolitics. It was an existential condition, an omnipresent tension that seeped into the collective subconscious and dictated the rhythm of daily life. Children who grew up in the 50s and 60s were indoctrinated with the fear of nuclear annihilation, participating in absurd school drills that taught them to hide under desks as a futile defense against the annihilating power of a hydrogen bomb. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was still a recent and traumatic memory, a moment when the world held its breath as the superpowers stared each other down, fingers hovering over the buttons that could end civilization in a matter of minutes. In 1969, the Vietnam War was escalating, becoming a brutal and bloody quagmire, broadcast in Technicolor into living rooms around the world. This was the first televised war, and the daily exposure to its raw brutality fueled a deep and widespread disillusionment with government authority, military propaganda, and the justifications for the conflict. The generation gap was not just a fashionable expression. It was a real and impassable chasm between an older generation, which still saw the world through the lens of World War II, and a patriotic morality, and a youth that saw only hypocrisy, corruption, and an insatiable war machine sending their peers to die in distant jungles for increasingly incomprehensible reasons. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, a feeling that the old paradigms were failing, and that humanity, with all its technological advancement, was on a collision course with itself. It was on this fertile ground of paranoia, disillusionment, and existential dread that the seed of Epitaph germinated. The song is not just a product of its time, it is an acute symptom of its disease. Unlike the more direct protest anthems of the era, such as those by Bob Dylan or Joan Baez, which often pointed fingers and called for change, Epitaph takes a far more terrifying and philosophical approach. The song offers no solutions, makes no calls to action, provides no comfort. It simply holds up a mirror to a world gone mad and describes the horrifying reflection with poetic precision and overwhelming musical grandeur. Its power as an anti-war statement derives precisely from this absence of explicit protest. It is not a sign at a demonstration. It is a requiem sung at the graveside of a future that may never come to be. The lyrical architecture of Epitaph is a testament to the genius of Peter Sinfield, the band's non-performing member credited with words and illumination. Sinfield was more a poet in the tradition of the symbolists or dark romantics than a conventional rock lyricist, and his words for Epitaph are a masterclass in the power of evocative imagery and multi-layered metaphor. The song begins with a verse that immediately establishes a tone of crumbling certainty. The wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. This is a powerful metaphor for the collapse of all established wisdom, be it religious, political, or philosophical. The old axioms, the dogmas, the guiding principles that were supposed to keep society on a righteous path are disintegrating. The foundations of belief are giving way. This is not just a statement about a specific war. It is about the systemic failure of the very ideas that are supposed to prevent them. It is the echo of Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God, expanded to encompass the death of all certainties in a century defined by 2 world wars, and the constant threat of a third, definitive one. Sinfield then juxtaposes this decay with an image of chilling and disturbing beauty. Upon the instruments of death, the sunlight brightly gleams. This verse is an exercise in brutal realism. It strips away any remnant of romanticism or glory from war. The instruments of death, the bombs, the missiles, the flying fortresses, the machinery of slaughter, are not depicted as monstrous entities lurking in the shadows. On the contrary, they are polished, gleaming objects, products of technological pride, bathed in sunlight like monuments to humanity's perverse ability to engineer its own destruction with scientific precision. The horror lies in the normalization of this reality, in the cold aesthetic of annihilation. It is the calculated logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, where the potential for global holocaust is just another factor in the equation of geopolitical strategy. The beauty of the sunlight on the metal of death creates a cognitive dissonance that forces the listener to confront the banality of evil in its most technocratic form. The verse continues, delving into the psychological impact of this latent and constant terror, when every man is torn apart, with nightmares and with dreams. This speaks directly to the schizoid nature of modern existence, a theme explored much more violently and chaotically in the album's opening track, 21st Century Schizoid Man. It is the anxiety of living in a world where personal aspirations and fears are dwarfed by the overwhelming possibility of a collective and meaningless end. The final couplet of the first verse is perhaps the most devastating in its simplicity. Will no one lay the laurel wreath when silence drowns the screams? The laurel wreath is an ancient symbol of victory, of triumph, of glory. Sinfield's question is rhetorical and utterly bleak. In a total war, a nuclear holocaust, there are no victors. There are no victory parades. Who will be left to celebrate when the only result is a profound and deafening silence that occupies the space where the screams of billions of dying people used to be? It is the complete nullification of the very concept of military glory, an idea that has driven empires and justified countless atrocities throughout human history. The chorus is the cry of an individual lost in this landscape of collective despair, a declaration of total existential bewilderment. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. The narrator does not pretend to have answers. He offers no path to salvation. His legacy, the words to be carved on his tombstone, will be a testament to his own confusion. This is the raw, honest voice of an individual swallowed by the madness of history, unable to comprehend the logic of a world marching consciously towards the abyss. There is a glimmer of desperate, almost sarcastic hope in the next line. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh. But it is immediately annihilated by the crushing weight of reality. But I fear tomorrow I'll be crying. This is not just sadness, it is a premonition, a certainty of the grief to come. The repetition of this phrase, with Greg Lake's voice cracking with emotion in each pass, transforms it into a mantra of impending sorrow, a personal prophecy that becomes universal. The second verse shifts the focus from the symptoms of decay to its root cause, inherently human failure. Between the iron gates of fate, The seeds of time were sown and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. This paints a picture of history, not as a random process, but as a path forged by the deliberate actions of the powerful, the elites, the figures who shape our world, the politicians, the generals, the industrialists. But it is the next two lines that deliver the lyrical coup de grace, a statement so potent and timeless that it has become a philosophical aphorism in its own right. Knowledge is a deadly friend, if no one sets the rules. Here, Sinfield identifies the central paradox of the 20th century. Humanity has achieved unprecedented scientific and technological knowledge, but this knowledge has far outpaced its moral and ethical wisdom. We unlocked the power of the atom before we learned to control our own primal instincts for tribalism, conflict, and domination. It is the myth of Prometheus retold for the nuclear age. The fire we stole from the gods is now used to incinerate ourselves. This knowledge, without the framework of rules, of wisdom, of empathy, becomes the very tool of our destruction. It is the lament of J. Robert Oppenheimer after the first atomic bomb test, echoing the Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And who wields this deadly knowledge? Sinfield's conclusion is as direct and politically incorrect as it gets. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. This is not a critique of a specific political party or ideology. It is an overwhelming condemnation of the entire political class, a cry of frustration at the absurdity of entrusting the survival of the human species to leaders who seem motivated by ego, greed, paranoia, and a staggering lack of foresight. It is a sentiment that transcends the Cold War and resonates with chilling accuracy in any era where short-sighted and incompetent leadership prevails, where decisions of monumental consequence are made by individuals who seem incapable of seeing beyond the next election cycle or the next geopolitical maneuver. It is the terrifying realization that the apocalypse may not come from an act of calculated evil, but from a stupid miscalculation, a bluff that went too far, a communication failure between leaders who refused to back down. Musically, Epitaph is as monumental and terrifying as its lyrics. The composition, credited to the four performing members of the band, Robert Fripp on guitar, Ian MacDonald on reeds, woodwinds, and keyboards, Greg Lake on bass and vocals, and Michael Giles on drums, is a masterpiece of dynamic tension and sonic architecture. It is here that the perspectives of the instrumentalist and the theorist merge to create the song's overwhelming emotional impact. The piece is in the key of E minor, a common choice for somber and tragic music, but its harmonic language is anything but simple. The chord progressions are deliberate and funereal, moving with a kind of majestic gravity that amplifies the lyrical weight. The structure does not follow the conventional pop formula. It unfolds like a classical piece, with distinct movements, recurring themes, and a dramatic development that leads to a cataclysmic climax. The song's introduction is a perfect example of this approach. It begins not with a guitar riff or a vocal line, but with a slow, ominous roll on timpani, courtesy of Michael Giles. This musical gesture immediately evokes the sound of a military procession or a classical funeral march, setting a tone of high seriousness and impending doom. It is a call to attention, a silencing of the room for the sermon that is about to be delivered. Next, a stark and austere acoustic guitar arpeggio from Robert Fripp enters, outlining the basic harmony. The pattern itself, weaving through chords like E minor and A minor, is deceptively simple, but its nakedness and precision create a sense of vulnerability and isolation, like a single human voice in a vast and desolate landscape. Then the beast is unleashed. The mellotron. If a single instrument can be credited with defining the apocalyptic sound of Epitaph, it is this strange and wonderful keyboard. The mellotron was an electromechanical analog precursor to modern samplers. Under each key was a length of magnetic tape containing a recording of a real instrument, in this case predominantly strings and a choir. When a key was pressed, the tape was drawn across a playback head, producing a sound that was organic, yet at the same time strangely artificial and ghostly. The slight fluctuations in pitch, wow and flutter, and the imperfect attack and decay of the notes gave the mellotron a haunting and mournful quality that a perfectly synthesized string section could never replicate. It was the sound of a ghost orchestra. Ian MacDonald, the band's multi-instrumentalist genius, was the master of this machine. In Epitaph, he doesn't just play the mellotron, he conducts it like a full orchestra from hell. The main string theme that enters after the guitar is a towering, sorrowful melody that seems to weep for all of humanity. The chords are immense, layered, saturated with a sense of epic-scale tragedy. The use of the mellotron's choir sound adds a layer of ecclesiastical solemnity, as if we are hearing a funereal chant in a ruined cathedral. When Greg Lake's voice enters, it is not the aggressive, distorted rock scream of Schizoid Man, but a voice of profound, theatrical despair. Lake, who would later form Emerson, Lake and Palmer, possessed a voice of incredible purity and power, the timbre of a cathedral choir boy with the soul of a rock musician. His performance on Epitaph is, without a doubt, the greatest of his career. He does not just sing the words, he embodies their meaning, his delivery conveying a feeling of absolute desolation that is almost unbearable to witness. The clarity and precision of his diction ensure that Sinfield's prophetic words are heard not as mere lyrics, but as a sermon delivered at the end of days. His ability to move from a vulnerable whisper to a full-throated cry without losing control is what emotionally anchors the entire composition. The song's structure is built on a foundation of extreme dynamic shifts, one of the pillars of progressive rock. The verses are relatively sparse, carried by Fripp's acoustic guitar, Giles's subtle and tasteful drumming, and Lake's commanding vocal, all draped in the ever-present funereal shroud of the mellotron. This creates an atmosphere of tense, quiet reflection. Then the chorus erupts. The volume swells dramatically, Giles's drumming becomes more powerful and cymbal-heavy, and the mellotron swells into an overwhelming crescendo, a tidal wave of sound that threatens to consume the listener. This dynamic contrast is a musical reflection of the lyrical themes, the quiet, internal nightmares and dreams of the individual giving way to the deafening external screams of a world at war. It is the sonic representation of the transition from personal anxiety to collective panic. The instrumental section, which on the album sleeve is informally associated with the subtitle March for No Reason, is the song's tormented heart. Here, the militaristic feel hinted at in the introduction is made explicit. Giles lays down a martial rhythm, but it is a broken, stumbling march, devoid of any heroism. Over this rhythmic bass, the mellotron becomes a chaotic swirl of sound. MacDonald overdubs multiple layers of the instrument, creating a dense, dissonant texture that sounds like an orchestra tearing itself apart. There is a particularly notable moment where he exploits the mellotron's natural pitch instability to his advantage, bending the notes to create a sound that resembles an air raid siren or a wail of collective anguish. It is the sonic representation of purposeless conflict, a march with no objective, no glory, and no meaning, a perfect metaphor for the senselessness of the era's wars, fought for increasingly abstract ideological reasons with a terribly concrete human cost. After this instrumental chaos, the first verse is repeated, but this time the delivery is completely different. The quiet contemplation of the opening is gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fury. Lake's voice is no longer just sorrowful. It is straining, almost shouting, filled with a righteous anger and terror. The mellotron is louder, more aggressive, the drums more thunderous. This is the sound of despair turning to rage, of the final horrifying realization that the end is truly nigh. The song then moves into a repeating chorus, which serves as its outro. The phrase, "But I fear tomorrow I'll be crying," is sung over and over, each repetition more desperate than the last, as the layers of mellotron, bass, and drums build into a final cataclysmic wall of sound, before an abrupt, dissonant keyboard flourish cuts it all to silence. The effect is completely draining, leaving the listener in a state of stunned reflection, like the sole survivor of a catastrophe. To label Epitaph as merely a protest song is to diminish its magnitude. It transcends that category. While many anti-war songs of the 60s were folk-based and lyrically direct, Aiming to rally people to a cause, Epitaph belongs to a different tradition. It is a work of high art, a symphonic rock-tone poem that uses the language of classical music and the power of rock instrumentation to create an immersive and deeply disturbing emotional experience. Its influence can be seen in the ambitious, large-scale compositions of later progressive rock bands like Yes, Genesis, and Pink Floyd. But few, if any, ever achieved its level of raw, apocalyptic power. Its status as an anti-war anthem is not rooted in a desire for peace in the peace and love sense of the hippie movement. Its message is far darker and more realistic. The song argues against war not by celebrating peace, but by unflinchingly staring into the abyss of what war, in the nuclear age, truly means. Total and utter annihilation. A world where the only legacy is confusion, and the only sound is silence. It is a work of profound pessimism, a warning that remains as relevant today as it was in 1969. The specific political tensions of the Cold War may have shifted in form, but the instruments of death are more sophisticated than ever, and the fate of humanity still seems, all too often, to rest in the hands of fools. Anxieties about environmental destruction, social collapse, and the failure of global leadership are just new manifestations of the same fundamental fear that animates Epitaph. The composition offers no hope. It offers no path forward. Its purpose is to shock, to awe, and to terrify the listener into contemplating the consequences of our own destructive tendencies. It is a musical memento mori for the entire human race. By forcing us to confront the bleakest possible future, it implicitly makes the most powerful anti-war statement imaginable, that any path, no matter how difficult, is preferable to the one that ends in the cracked and broken landscape this song so brilliantly and terrifyingly describes. It is a harrowing listen, but an essential one. It is the sound of a generation's deepest fears given voice, a timeless and chilling work of art that serves as a permanent epitaph for the very idea of a glorious war. It is a sonic reminder that, in the end, confusion may be the only legacy we leave if we fail to learn the lessons that history, and songs like this one, so desperately try to teach us.